I stood there that morning, staring at the wall of cheap lumber hammered into my driveway, coffee cooling in my hand. The fence wasn't even straight. Uneven posts, crooked boards, slapped together with just enough effort to make a point. Karen Thompson's signature move, and tacked dead center, was a bright orange violation notice, its edges flapping in the breeze like it was proud of itself. Emergency HOA Enforcement, it said. Noncompliant Vehicle Storage. Signed with the same looping, arrogant scrawl I'd seen too many times before. She really thought this was it. That fencing me in was the final blow. I could almost hear her voice in my head, rehearsing what she'd tell the other homeowners at the next meeting. We had no choice. He left us no choice. As if she was some hero, saving the neighborhood from a man who parked his own truck in his own driveway. She didn't have the slightest idea who she was dealing with. Not a tired old man with nothing left, but the one person who still held all the cards. I gave her the benefit of the doubt for too long. But today I'm finished playing neighborly. Today I'm tearing it all down. This intense story of arrogance, revenge, and one man's quiet fight for justice will leave you speechless. When a power-hungry HOA president pushes her luck one time too many, she discovers she picked a fight with the wrong neighbor, one who holds all the power. Before we dive back in, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you love stories where karma comes knocking hard, make sure you're subscribed. When I first moved into Willow Bend, I wasn't looking to make a statement. I wasn't here to stir up trouble or prove a point. I just wanted quiet. After nearly 2 decades in the world of high-stakes development, negotiating with city officials, battling corporate sharks, and turning empty land into sprawling neighborhoods, I was tired. Bone tired. I'd made more than enough money to disappear, so I did. Bought a simple ranch house on Lot 14, tucked under a canopy of old oaks at the edge of the subdivision I'd designed years ago. Funny thing was, nobody ever connected me to it. I made sure of that. To them, I was just Griffin, some middle-aged guy who drove an old pickup and kept to himself. It was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't put my name on any of the property records. The house was held under a trust. I never attended the HOA meetings in person, always voting by proxy. And when Karen Thompson took over as president of the HOA 2 years ago, I figured she was just another self-important busybody with too much time on her hands. I had no idea how far she'd push things. It started small, a notice about my grass length, then a fine for leaving my trash bin out an extra 12 hours past collection. I paid them. Not because I had to, but because I didn't care enough to fight. This wasn't my battle, not then. But Karen wasn't the type to leave well enough alone. She was relentless in a way I'd only ever seen in corporate boardrooms. The kind of person who needs power the way the rest of us need air. And in this sleepy neighborhood, the HOA was her throne. I watched from my porch as she strutted from house to house, clipboard clutched in one manicured hand, smartphone in the other, snapping pictures of porch swings she didn't like, wind chimes that were too loud, paint colors that didn't fit her idea of harmonious. Some neighbors fought her. Most gave up. You could see it in their eyes, the way they averted their gaze when she walked by. They knew they were trapped under her thumb and they weren't strong enough or rich enough to fight back. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't. But the thing about people like Karen, if you don't give them resistance, they start to believe they're invincible. She thought I was just another easy win. Another man too tired to care. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know I owned the land beneath her house, the clubhouse she held her meetings in, and half the rental properties she relied on to prop up her fake empire. I wanted peace. But Karen Thompson made sure I wouldn't get it. And I wasn't going to let her walk away without knowing exactly how big a mistake she'd made. It was a Tuesday morning when the first official strike came. A bright orange violation notice stuck under my windshield wiper like some kind of twisted gift. I found it after finishing my run, still wiping the sweat from my neck when I spotted that familiar HOA letterhead. I holler excessive vehicle storage, it read. Violation of community guidelines, section 14, subsection C. Karen had a talent for digging up obscure rules that most people had never even heard of. This one? A half-forgotten clause about the impact of vehicular clutter on neighborhood harmony. I almost laughed. But as I scanned the details, that laugh died in my throat. She'd hit me with a $100 fine. Not because of some broken-down junker rotting in the yard, but because I had 3 cars in my own driveway. My truck, the old Mustang I'd been restoring for years, and my nephew's sedan, which had been parked there for less than 48 hours while he visited family. I took a step back, arms crossed, staring at the vehicles lined up neatly in front of my house. None of them on the street. None of them blocking anyone's view. Just a clean, organized driveway on property I legally owned outright. It wasn't about cars, it was about control. Karen loved to bait people into playing by her rules. She counted on homeowners being too busy or too tired to push back. A notice here, a fine there. Most would just pay and move on. But I'd played this game before on a much bigger scale. I knew how people like her worked, and I was done letting her play me. I grabbed my phone and started documenting everything. Photos from every angle, time-stamped videos, a scan of the letter she'd left. I backed it all up in 3 different places. That day, I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it Karen War, because that's what this was turning into, even if she didn't know it yet. Over the next few weeks, more letters followed. Warnings for trash cans left out too long, even though my cameras showed I brought them in within an hour of pickup. A citation for non-compliant mailbox color, despite the fact that it was the exact same color it had been when I moved in and I'd never once heard a complaint. Then it was the grass, half an inch too long according to her tape measure. Another fine. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I paid every fine, quietly. And then I filed the evidence away, every scrap of it, building a case one petty violation at a time. Karen thought she was wearing me down. She thought she was teaching me a lesson. She had no idea I was the one taking notes, and when the time came, I'd be ready to teach her something she'd never forget. I woke up before sunrise, as I always did, poured myself a black coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and prepared for the quiet. But there was no quiet that morning. The first thing I noticed was the unnatural stillness. The second thing was the fence. It ran the length of my driveway, 6 feet tall, rough-hewn wood slapped together like some makeshift barrier at a construction site. The posts were anchored into the concrete, cracked and splintered where they'd driven the bolts in without care. They'd even chained it shut with a padlock, like they expected me to try and ram through it. Tacked right in the center was Karen's trademark orange notice. Emergency HOA Enforcement. Noncompliant Vehicle Storage. Her signature was there, bold and proud with her little flourish at the end. I stood there for a long moment, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at what she'd done. It wasn't just a fence, it was a message. She was telling me, and everyone else in the neighborhood, that she ran this place, that she could do whatever she wanted. And it wasn't going to stop here. I knew that as well as I knew my own name. I finished my coffee in silence, then set the mug down on the porch railing, walked to the fence, ran my fingers along the cheap wood, noting the splinters. I paced its length, taking in every uneven panel, every sloppy nail. No permits posted anywhere. No survey markers. Just the raw confidence of someone who thought they were untouchable. But nobody is untouchable. Not when I'm involved. I went back inside, pulled out my laptop, and opened the folder I'd been building for months. Karen War had gotten pretty thick by then. Photos, videos, emails, copies of every notice she'd ever sent me. But this was something different. This was her overstepping in a way I could finally use. By noon, I'd sent out emails to my legal team, property rights experts, surveyors, code enforcement contacts I hadn't spoken to in years. They got back to me fast. Faster than I expected. Apparently, Karen hadn't just violated HOA guidelines. She'd broken at least 3 city ordinances. Illegal construction, trespassing, property damage, and those were just the obvious ones. I kept my voice calm when I called her, told her we needed to talk. She laughed, thinking I was ready to beg. She had no idea what was coming. Over the next few weeks, more letters followed. Warnings for trash cans left out too long, even though my cameras showed I brought them in within an hour of pickup. A citation for non-compliant mailbox color, despite the fact that it was the exact same color it had been when I moved in and I'd never once heard a complaint. Then it was the grass, half an inch too long according to her tape measure. Another fine. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I paid every fine, quietly. And then I filed the evidence away, every scrap of it, building a case one petty violation at a time. Karen thought she was wearing me down. She thought she was teaching me a lesson. She had no idea I was the one taking notes, and when the time came, I'd be ready to teach her something she'd never forget. I woke up before sunrise, as I always did, poured myself a black coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and prepared for the quiet. But there was no quiet that morning. The first thing I noticed was the unnatural stillness. The second thing was the fence. It ran the length of my driveway, 6 feet tall, rough-hewn wood slapped together like some makeshift barrier at a construction site. The posts were anchored into the concrete, cracked and splintered where they'd driven the bolts in without care. They'd even chained it shut with a padlock, like they expected me to try and ram through it. Tacked right in the center was Karen's trademark orange notice. Emergency HOA Enforcement. Noncompliant Vehicle Storage. Her signature was there, bold and proud with her little flourish at the end. I stood there for a long moment, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at what she'd done. It wasn't just a fence, it was a message. She was telling me, and everyone else in the neighborhood, that she ran this place, that she could do whatever she wanted. And it wasn't going to stop here. I knew that as well as I knew my own name. I finished my coffee in silence, then set the mug down on the porch railing, walked to the fence, ran my fingers along the cheap wood, noting the splinters. I paced its length, taking in every uneven panel, every sloppy nail. No permits posted anywhere. No survey markers. Just the raw confidence of someone who thought they were untouchable. But nobody is untouchable. Not when I'm involved. I went back inside, pulled out my laptop, and opened the folder I'd been building for months. Karen War had gotten pretty thick by then. Photos, videos, emails, copies of every notice she'd ever sent me. But this was something different. This was her overstepping in a way I could finally use. By noon, I'd sent out emails to my legal team, property rights experts, surveyors, code enforcement contacts I hadn't spoken to in years. They got back to me fast. Faster than I expected. Apparently, Karen hadn't just violated HOA guidelines. She'd broken at least 3 city ordinances. Illegal construction, trespassing, property damage, and those were just the obvious ones. I kept my voice calm when I called her, told her we needed to talk. She laughed, thinking I was ready to beg. She had no idea what was coming. Karen thought she'd boxed me in. She thought that fence was her line in the sand. What she didn't know was that I'd built the sand she was standing on, owned the dirt beneath her house, controlled every line item on the HOA's precious budget. And now, she'd given me the excuse I needed to burn it all down. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. sharp, in the same community clubhouse where Karen had held court for years. Normally, these meetings were dry affairs. Karen perched at the front table, clipboard in hand, smug smile plastered on her face, while a handful of tired neighbors sat in plastic chairs, pretending to care about lawn lengths and mailbox designs. But that night, word had spread that something was different. People were curious. The room was packed. I didn't sit in the back this time. I walked straight to the front and stood across from Karen, laying my leather portfolio flat on the table with a quiet thump that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Karen glanced up, eyebrow arched, and for a second she still wore that same look. That same irritating, condescending smile. She was used to winning, but this wasn't her game anymore. "I'll start," I said. My voice was calm, steady. "My name is Griffin Walker." That got a few murmurs from the room. I let them settle before I spoke again. "Owner and CEO of Walker Development Group." I slid a document from the folder and laid it in front of her, "which happens to own 70% of the properties in Willow Bend." Karen's hand froze over her clipboard. I watched the color drain from her face as she read the paperwork. The list of properties, the LLCs, the lease agreements. The lines connecting everything to me. It took her a moment longer to realize what else was there. Her house, the land it sat on, all under my name. "This has to be some mistake," she said, voice tight. "It's not." I opened another folder. "You've been trespassing on my land every time you've crossed the property line. Every fine you've levied, every violation notice, illegal." I let the weight of the words hang there. "You're in breach of the HOA charter. Breach of lease. Breach of more contracts than I can count." She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. "You thought you were running this place," I continued. "But you've been a tenant in my neighborhood since day one." There was a shift in the room. You could feel it, the silence breaking into whispers. Neighbors who'd been terrified of Karen for years now realizing they'd been afraid of a puppet on a string she didn't even know existed. Some of them leaned forward, some exchanged glances, but all of them were watching me now. "I've let this go on long enough," I said, "but after the fence, you made it personal." I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder. Karen sat there frozen, hands gripping the edges of the clipboard like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her mouth opened once more, but no words came. For the first time since I'd moved here, I saw fear in her eyes. Not the fake fear she used for sympathy, real fear, because she finally knew who she was dealing with. By the time the audit reports landed on my desk, I already knew what we'd find. Karen had been sloppy. People like her always are when they've gone unchecked for too long. But even I was surprised by how bad it was. The numbers didn't lie. She wasn't just enforcing petty rules, she was lining her pockets while she did it. Over the years, Karen had collected fines for every made-up violation she could conjure. Trash cans left out a few hours too long. Grass half an inch too high. Holiday decorations left up past her arbitrary deadlines. The fines were small at first, $20 here, $50 there, but they added up, and no one had ever questioned where the money went. Until now. My legal team worked fast. They traced the accounts, followed the money trail through a web of shell companies and personal slush funds. HOA funds that were supposed to go toward neighborhood improvements had paid for her personal vacations, designer clothes, and consulting fees to her husband's fake landscaping business. She even charged the HOA for the fence that blocked my driveway. And she paid cash. No permits, no contracts, just a quiet deal made in the middle of the night. I called for another emergency HOA meeting, one Karen couldn't skip. This time I wasn't the only one holding a thick folder. Her own board members, Gary Matthews and Brenda Collins, sat stiff and pale at the front table. They'd seen the reports. They knew what was coming, and they knew the ship was sinking fast. I stood in front of the room and laid out every detail. The missing funds, the fraudulent contracts, the violations issued without cause. Every neighbor in that room had been affected in some way. Some had paid fines they couldn't afford. Others had been harassed until they sold their homes and left. Now they were hearing where that money went and what it bought. Karen sat there stone-faced, her hands trembling as she gripped her clipboard. For once, she didn't speak, not even to defend herself, because there was nothing left to say. When Gary stood up, I half expected him to try and defend her. He didn't. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Effective immediately, I resign from the board." Brenda followed without a word, leaving Karen sitting there alone. I looked at her one last time. "This HOA is finished," I said, "but we're not done." I handed the file of evidence to my attorney, who left immediately to deliver it to the county prosecutor's office. Fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. The list was long, the charges were serious, and Karen's name was on every page. For years she'd ruled this place like a kingdom, but tonight her crown was gone, and everyone was finally free to look her in the eye and see the fraud she really was. In the days that followed the audit meeting, Karen did what people like her always do when the walls close in. She scrambled. Desperation makes some folks quiet. Karen, it made her louder. She started walking the neighborhood again, clipboard clutched tight like a shield, sunglasses covering the panic in her eyes. She knocked on doors that hadn't opened for her in months. She smiled that brittle smile and made promises she had no way of keeping. "Stick with me," I overheard her say to Mr. Jeffers, who lived 2 houses down. "I can make sure your property values stay high. You don't want this place turning into chaos, do you?" He didn't answer, just closed his door without a word. She cornered the Martinez family next, 2 blocks over. They'd lived here for years, raising their kids under her watchful gaze. Karen tried playing friendly, offering to waive their overdue fines if they supported her at the next meeting. I watched from across the street as Mrs. Martinez shook her head, clutching her youngest child to her side as she turned away. Karen wasn't giving up. She called an emergency meeting herself, one last desperate attempt to rally support. She promised lower dues, better security, exclusive amenities for the homeowners who voted to reinstate her power. The clubhouse was half empty that night. Those who showed up mostly sat with their arms crossed, listening without saying a word. Her voice was tight, no longer confident. "We can restore order," she said, pacing the front of the room. "We don't have to let him take over. We don't have to lose control of our neighborhood." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. I was standing in the back, arms folded, watching. She tried fear next. "Do you really want one person controlling all the property here?" she said, her voice rising. "Do you want him turning this place into a rental slum? Do you want strangers moving in? People who don't respect our standards?" Whispers rippled through the room, but not the kind she was hoping for. "We're tired of your standards, Karen," someone said quietly from the front row. Karen faltered, then recovered, forcing her smile back in place. "I can protect you," she insisted. "I always have." Nobody believed her. Not anymore. I stayed silent. There was no point in arguing with someone already defeated. She was swinging at shadows, begging for relevance she no longer had. The neighborhood had finally seen what lay beneath her polished veneer, and they wanted nothing to do with it. When the meeting ended, Karen walked out without a single supporter at her side. She crossed the parking lot alone, her shoulders squared but stiff, like she was holding herself together through sheer willpower. The kingdom she'd ruled for years was gone, and all she had left were empty promises no one wanted to hear. I should have expected Karen's next move. She was never one to back down quietly. After her last failed attempt to rally the neighborhood, I knew she'd come out swinging again. And she did, only this time, it was clumsy and reckless. She was running out of moves, and it showed. The first sign was the bright green sticker slapped across my front door one morning. "City code violation," it read in big block letters, accusing me of unpermitted construction and improper drainage systems. I almost laughed. I hadn't built anything on this property since moving in. Everything had been up to code since day one. I made sure of that. But that wasn't the point. Karen was playing dirty, calling in favors or faking complaints to get code enforcement involved. She thought if she could bog me down in bureaucracy, she might get me to back off. She underestimated how deep my roots ran in this town. I called Greg, the head of the city's code enforcement office. We'd worked together on multiple developments over the years. When I explained what happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Greg sighed. "Karen Thompson," he muttered. "She's filed 3 complaints in the last 24 hours, all of them against you." "She'll bury herself," I said. And she did. Her lies didn't stop there. By noon, the neighborhood's Facebook group was flooded with posts, anonymous accounts spreading rumors about me. That I was turning the community into a massive rental complex. That I was planning to pave over the park and put in a parking lot for my luxury car collection. My personal favorite was the claim that I was secretly working with a foreign developer to bulldoze the entire subdivision and build condos. It was pathetic, transparent, but Karen was desperate enough to try anything. My legal team didn't waste time. By that afternoon, Karen had a thick envelope delivered straight to her door. Cease and desist orders. She was to stop making false and defamatory statements about me immediately. Any further action on her part would result in a lawsuit that would finish whatever was left of her reputation and her finances. But that wasn't all. The second envelope was heavier. Eviction papers. Karen never read the fine print when she took over the HOA. She didn't know her house sat on leased land owned by my company. And by violating her lease terms, engaging in fraud, harassment, and breaching HOA rules, she gave me legal grounds to end her tenancy. She opened the door when my attorneys knocked. She didn't say a word, just snatched the papers from them and slammed it shut so hard the porch light rattled. But I saw her face before she did. No smugness, no arrogance, just fear. Karen had spent years making everyone in this neighborhood afraid of her. Now she finally understood how it felt. Eviction day arrived on a cloudless morning. The sky was sharp and clear, the kind of day that should have felt peaceful, but the air was thick with anticipation. People pretended to water their lawns, stood at mailboxes longer than necessary, all of them waiting for the same thing. Karen Thompson's reign was ending, and no one wanted to miss the show. The moving trucks pulled up first. Clean white vans with uniformed crews, professionals who'd done this before. They worked quickly, quietly, efficient in a way that made it clear this wasn't their first eviction. Then came the security team, hired through a private firm I trusted. Calm, serious men who said little but saw everything. They stationed themselves at the front and back of the house, giving her nowhere to slip away unnoticed. At precisely 9 a.m., the lead attorney and 2 county officials knocked on Karen's door. It took a full minute before it opened. When it did, she stood there in her silk robe, sunglasses perched on her head, as if this was all just a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right smile. But there was something wild in her eyes, something cracked. "You can't do this," she hissed, her voice tight but trembling. "This is harassment. I'll have you all arrested." One of the officers calmly handed her the paperwork. "You've been served. You have until noon to vacate." Karen's mouth opened to argue, but nothing came out. Just a thin, breathless sound. She slammed the door shut. A moment later, the movers got to work. They boxed up her life while she raged inside. Every so often, we could hear her through the walls, shouting threats, pacing back and forth. Her shrill voice echoed in the stillness of the neighborhood, but no one moved to help her. No one stepped forward. The same people who'd once feared her fines and her clipboard now watched in silence as it all fell apart. By 11:30, she was out of time. She tried to block the movers, standing in the middle of the living room with her arms spread wide like she could stop them by sheer willpower. When that didn't work, she switched tactics, begging, pleading, promising favors to anyone who might be listening. But nobody was. At noon, the security team escorted her out. She dug her heels in as they guided her down the front steps, shaking her head in disbelief like it was still some mistake she could undo. Her designer shoes scraped against the concrete. Her hands clutched at her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed numbers no one answered. She stood there on the sidewalk, surrounded by packed boxes and silence. I watched from my porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When her gaze met mine, there was no smugness left, just the hollow stare of someone who'd finally realized they'd lost everything. The moving trucks pulled away, the doors to her house were locked, and Karen Thompson was no longer a part of Willow Bend. It didn't take long for Karen's house to hit the auction block. Once the eviction was finalized and the liens were called in, the foreclosure paperwork moved through faster than anyone expected. I wasn't surprised. Karen had been juggling too many debts for too long. Thinking she was clever enough to stay ahead of the game, she wasn't. Her arrogance had caught up with her, and now her beloved home was just another asset on a list of things to be sold off to the highest bidder. The auction was held on a warm Saturday morning in front of the county courthouse. A small crowd gathered, curious neighbors mixed with sharp-eyed investors. I recognized most of them: flippers, real estate sharks, people who saw an opportunity to gut the place and turn a profit. Karen's house was valuable after all. Large lot, corner property. She'd made sure to keep it pristine on the outside, even as her life rotted from within. I stood near the back, dressed like I always was these days. Plain jeans, an old jacket, ball cap pulled low. Nobody gave me a second glance. And when the bidding started, I stayed quiet at first, letting the usual suspects drive the price up. They were vultures, circling something already dead. I waited until the last two bidders started to hesitate, until the number got just high enough to make them nervous. Then I made my move. One clear bid, strong, final. The auctioneer's gavel slammed down not 5 minutes later. Sold! The crowd turned, some trying to figure out who I was. But I was already moving through them, paperwork in hand, as the deal was sealed. Karen's house was mine now. I owned it free and clear. I didn't buy it out of spite. I didn't need to. I bought it because it was time to give something back, to fix what she had broken, and maybe to remind everyone that this neighborhood could be something better. A month later, the renovation crews showed up. We gutted the interior, stripped it to the bones. That house had been a monument to Karen's control, every room designed to impress or intimidate. I wasn't interested in preserving that. Instead, we turned it into something useful. When the work was done, we opened the doors. Karen's old house was now the Willow Bend Community Center, a place where neighbors could gather without fear of fines or judgments. We built a playground in the backyard, planted a community garden out front, and set up a free library by the curb. The clubhouse was repurposed into a space for weekend markets and neighborhood events. Standing there, on opening day, watching kids run through the yard where Karen's rose bushes used to be, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the quiet I'd sought when I first moved here, but the kind that comes when you know the fight is over and you finally won. I knew Karen wasn't finished. Even after the eviction, even after the house was sold off and transformed into the community center, I expected her to make one last desperate move. She'd spent too many years getting her way to let go without flailing in every direction first. So when the envelope from her attorney arrived on my doorstep, I wasn't even surprised. She was suing me. The papers accused me of harassment, emotional distress, unlawful eviction, and a half-dozen other ridiculous charges. She claimed I had manipulated the HOA board into targeting her, that I had used my position to force her from her home illegally, and that I had destroyed her reputation in the process. I read through every page of the complaint twice, more amused than angry. Karen had always been good at rewriting the story to suit her needs. This was just another fantasy where she was the innocent victim, wronged by the big bad developer. My legal team wasn't amused, though. They were efficient and thorough, filing a motion to dismiss within 48 hours. I didn't have to lift a finger. Every accusation she made was easy to disprove. Every action I had taken was documented, signed, and filed by the book. I'd made sure of that from the start. If Karen thought she could bluff her way into a settlement, she was about to learn a painful lesson. The court date came faster than expected. Karen showed up in person, dressed in a stiff business suit, her hair pulled tight like she was still trying to control something, anything. But she looked tired, older, smaller. She avoided my eyes when I walked in. I didn't bother hiding the fact that I was there. I sat quietly beside my attorney, watched the proceedings with my hands folded in my lap. Her lawyer tried to make a case out of it. He droned on about abuse of power, coercion, mental anguish. But it was all surface-level noise, no evidence, just the same bluster Karen had used to run the HOA. This wasn't her clubhouse, and the judge wasn't one of her neighbors too scared to speak up. It took less than an hour for the case to fall apart. The judge barely asked questions. Just flipped through the paperwork, his face unreadable until he finally looked over his glasses and said, "Dismissed." He paused, then added, "With prejudice." Karen's head dropped forward. Her attorney slumped back in his chair, defeated. And just like that, it was over. Except for one final blow. The judge awarded me full reimbursement of my legal fees. Every dime Karen had spent trying to sue me ended up costing her double. She left the courtroom without looking back, no audience left to play for, no power, just silence. I walked out into the sunlight, taking my time. That part of my life, the fight, the tension, the endless games, was finally behind me, and I was free. The neighborhood felt different after Karen was gone. It wasn't just the quiet, though that was noticeable too. No more early morning patrols, no more neighbors glancing over their shoulders when they took out the trash a few minutes late. It was the way people started to look at each other again, making eye contact, stopping for conversations they wouldn't have dared to have before. You could feel it in the air, like the place was finally breathing again. With the HOA officially dissolved, it was time to rebuild. Not just the houses or the sidewalks, but the trust we'd lost living under Karen's thumb. I didn't want to replace one dictatorship with another. This wasn't about me taking control. It was about giving the neighborhood back to the people who lived here, the way it always should have been. The first thing we did was repave the streets. Years of fines collected by Karen had never gone where they were supposed to. The cracks and potholes had been getting worse every month, but she'd spent that money on herself. Now it was being used the right way. We hired local contractors, ones who cared about the community, not just the paycheck. And by the end of the first month, Willow Bend's streets looked brand new. Next came the park. For years it had been ignored. The playground rusted and falling apart. Karen had claimed there wasn't enough money to fix it. Funny how that changed when her slush fund was seized and redirected. We tore out the old equipment and brought in something better. Safe, bright. A place where kids could play without worrying about splinters or broken swings. And we added a garden, one that the neighbors planted and maintained themselves. I even got my hands dirty for the first time in a long while. It felt good. The biggest change, though, wasn't something you could see. It was the rules, or the lack of them. We gathered at what used to be the HOA clubhouse, now a true community center, and drafted a simple agreement. No more nitpicking about mailbox colors. No fines for leaving holiday lights up too long. If someone's grass grew an inch higher than it should, no one cared. We agreed to take care of our homes because we wanted to, not because we were being threatened. What surprised me most was how quickly the neighborhood pulled together. People who had barely spoken before were suddenly volunteering to help each other out. Driveway repairs, fence building, weekend cookouts that turned into block parties. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is, but it was real, genuine. For the first time since I'd moved here, I saw Willow Bend for what it could be. Not a development I had designed on paper years ago, but a living, breathing place where people actually wanted to stay. And as I sat on my porch at sunset watching kids ride their bikes down the smooth, newly paved streets, I realized I'd finally built something I could be proud of. Not as a developer, but as a neighbor. It's funny how quickly people like Karen fade when the spotlight turns off. For years, she was the self-appointed queen of Willow Bend. Her clipboard and camera phone, her crown and scepter. But once the fence came down and the eviction was finalized, it was like she never existed at all. The neighborhood moved on faster than I ever expected. And Karen, she vanished. At first, there were rumors. Whispers that she'd moved to a neighboring town, renting a small apartment on the wrong side of the highway. Not the kind of place where HOA boards meet in fancy clubhouses or care about whether your flower beds are in compliance. Just another complex full of people too busy making ends meet to care about appearances. A place where she had no power, no say in anything. Someone said they saw her working at a small office downtown, admin job, filing paperwork for a property management company. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had fined people over mailbox colors and holiday decorations was now probably entering work orders for leaky faucets and broken blinds. She wasn't in charge anymore, not of anyone, not of anything. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Martinez, ran into her at the grocery store about a month after the house was auctioned. She said Karen looked thinner, worn out, like she hadn't slept right in weeks. No designer clothes, no diamond bracelets or expensive sunglasses. Just jeans and a faded polo shirt. She didn't even make eye contact when Mrs. Martinez passed her in the aisle. Didn't recognize her. Or pretended not to. For a while, I thought maybe Karen would try to reinvent herself somewhere else. Start over in another neighborhood, another HOA, another chance to build a little kingdom. But word gets around. People like her burn bridges until there's nothing left but smoke. No one wanted her in charge of anything anymore. And eventually even the rumors stopped. No one talked about Karen at the meetings. Not that we really had meetings anymore. We just gathered. Block parties, garden clubs, kids' soccer games. Nobody needed a president for that. We took care of each other because that's what neighbors do. I won't say I felt sorry for her. I didn't. Karen made her choices. She built her world out of control and fear. And when it crumbled, she was left standing in the ruins, alone. But I did feel something. Not satisfaction exactly. Not pride, just closure. She was no longer feared, no longer obeyed, no longer anything but a memory most people didn't care to bring up. The woman who once ruled Willow Bend with fines and threats had become just another face in a crowd, struggling to matter. And on quiet nights, sitting on my porch with a cold drink in hand, I realized the greatest punishment of all wasn't losing her house or her title or even her money. It was being forgotten. The final HOA meeting wasn't like the ones Karen used to hold. There was no agenda scribbled on a whiteboard, no clipboard-wielding enforcers eyeing the room for anyone out of line. It was standing room only, the old clubhouse packed wall-to-wall with neighbors who had spent too long living under rules they never agreed to, and now they were here to watch the end of it. I stood at the front of the room where Karen used to perch like a queen, gripping that pink gavel of hers like it meant something. There was no gavel now, just me, a stack of papers, and a simple promise I intended to keep. I cleared my throat, though I didn't need to. Everyone was already listening. "Thank you all for coming," I started. "I know these meetings used to be something most of us dreaded, so I'll keep this short." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. I could see the relief on their faces, the cautious hope. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some fine print to trip them up again. But not this time. "I'm here to close the book on Karen Thompson," I said. "For good." I laid out the documents, copies of the audits, records of the misused funds, evidence of her fraudulent fines, and the court rulings that backed it all up. I didn't pull any punches. I wanted them to see it for themselves, in black and white. Karen had stolen from this community. She had abused her power, and she had paid the price. I paused to let them absorb it. Then I took a deep breath. "As of today," I continued, "the Willow Bend HOA is officially dissolved." For a second, there was silence. It hung in the air, heavy and still. Then, like a spark catching dry grass, the room exploded. Cheers. Applause. People clapping each other on the back, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others wiping tears they didn't even try to hide. It was the sound of something breaking free. "I've arranged for the remaining HOA funds to be returned," I added, raising my voice just enough to carry over the celebration. "Everyone who paid fines under Karen's rule will receive restitution, and moving forward, we decide what happens here, together." They quieted a little at that, nodding, smiling. I saw Mrs. Chen sitting in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaking her cheeks. Mark The firefighter who'd been fined for parking his truck in front of his own house stood tall in the back, arms crossed, smiling like he hadn't in years. It wasn't about me. I hadn't done this for recognition or revenge. I'd done it because someone needed to. And now, standing in that room full of people who finally had their neighborhood back, I realized it had all been worth it. No more HOA, no more fear, just neighbors, and a fresh start. Months passed and Willow Bend became almost unrecognizable, but not because of new buildings or manicured lawns. It was the feeling. The tension that used to hum just beneath the surface, the fear of stepping out of line and finding a violation notice nailed to your door was gone. In its place was something simple, something honest. Community. The park we rebuilt was always busy now. You'd find kids playing on the new swings, their laughter spilling down the freshly paved streets. Saturday mornings turned into spontaneous neighborhood gatherings. People traded fresh vegetables from the community garden, swapped stories over coffee. Some of us even worked together on house projects we'd put off for years because we'd been too weighed down by Karen's constant threats. For the first time since moving here, people had a reason to smile when they walked outside. I found myself out on my porch most evenings, the same porch where I used to sit in silence, waiting for the next fine to land in my mailbox. Now I watched as neighbors strolled by, waving, stopping to chat. There was no HOA telling them they couldn't hang holiday lights or plant the flowers they wanted. Freedom was a simple thing, but you don't realize how precious it is until someone tries to take it away. As for Karen, she was no longer a name that came up much around here. She became a story parents told their kids when they asked why the neighborhood had so many rules before. That's what happens when you let the wrong person have too much power, they'd say. Some of the newer families didn't even know who she was. She was gone. Forgotten by most, but not by me. Every once in a while, I'd hear whispers of where she ended up. A small apartment across town, a job that barely paid the bills, no power, no influence, just another face in the crowd struggling to stay afloat. And that was fine. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't chasing revenge. She was living out the consequences of her choices. That was punishment enough. I finally understood what I had come to Willow Bend searching for. It wasn't just peace and quiet. It was belonging. I'd spent years building communities on paper, sketching out streets and plotting lots like pieces on a chessboard. But this was real. A place where people looked out for each other, where they didn't need a rule book or a president barking orders, where trust and respect did more to keep things running than any HOA fine ever could. I didn't need to own the neighborhood anymore. I just needed to be a part of it. And that was enough. As the sun dipped behind the houses I'd once designed on a blueprint, I took a deep breath and smiled. Willow Bend was finally the place I'd always imagined it could be. And I was home.